Good afternoon and welcome to the Strauss Center Brumley Fellow Speaker Series. My name is Sami Ayoub. I'm Associate Professor of Law and Middle Eastern Studies. Today we are very excited to have Professor Andrew Marsh, one of the important voices in political theory and modern Islamic political thought. I will say a few words about the Brumley Fellows program, then I will give the floor to Muhammad Abu Talha, who is a Brumley Fellow and my mentee, to introduce our speaker today. So before I start, I'd like to thank Professor Bobby Chisney, the director of the Strauss Center, and the James Baker Professor in Law, as well as Lindsay Stanek and the staff at the Strauss Center for working to bring Dr. Marsh to Austin. So the Brumley Next Generation Fellows Program at the Strauss Center provides research training and mentorship to exceptional undergraduate and graduate students at the University of Texas at Austin. Involving students in international affairs early in their careers is an important part of the Strauss Center's mission to prepare the next generation of leaders to help develop solutions to the most pressing public policy challenges. The program is made possible by the generous support of John and Rebecca Brumley. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Muhammad.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us in the first Brumley talk for this year. My name is Muhammad Abu Talha. I'm a second-year global policy student here at the LBJ School, and I am the Brumley Fellow for Terrorism and Counterterrorism Studies at the Strauss Center. I work with Professor Sami Ayoub, and we look at Islamist movement and their relations in North Africa with a focus on post-2011 Libya. I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Andrew Marsh. Professor Marsh is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. His research and teaching interests are in the areas of political philosophy, Islamic law and political thought, religion, and political theory. He is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Oxford, where he studied as a Marshall Scholar. Professor Marsh wrote his book, Islam and Liberal Citizenship, in 2009, and the book was an exploration of Islamic juridical discourse on the rights, loyalties, and obligations of Muslim minorities in liberal politics. The book won the 2009 award for the excellence in the study of religion from the American Academy of Religion. Professor Marsh has published articles on religion, liberalism, and Islamic law in the American Political Science Review, Philosophy and Public Affairs, Journal of Political Philosophy, European Journal of International Law, and Islamic Law and Society, amongst other publications. His recent book, published this year, The Caliphate of Man, explores the problem of divine and popular sovereignty in modern Islamic thought. So, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Andrew Marsh.
Thank you, Mohammed, for that very, very generous introduction. Thank you, Professor Ayoub, and everybody at the Strauss Center for this very, very generous invitation. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to all of you for coming out. I'll try to make it as interesting and worth your time as possible. This is the cover of my book that was published earlier in September. So the title of the book is pretty striking, The Caliphate of Man. Those of you with any sort of passing understanding of the civil war in Syria and Iraq over the past 7 to 10 years or so are probably familiar with this idea of a caliphate. ISIS famously claimed to have reestablished something called the caliphate. Even Donald Trump in his tweets refers now liberally to the idea that the caliphate has been destroyed, caliphate this and that. The concept of the caliphate, in fact, means something like a deputyship or a vicegerency or a lieutenancy. It means to stand in place of something else. In classical Islamic thought, the caliphate was held to be the supreme office for guarding the worldly and next worldly interests of the collective community of the Muslims. So the caliph was an individual, it was an office, and it was regarded by most schools of classical Sunni Islamic political thought to be a necessary office for the guardianship of the interests of the Muslim community. To establish the caliphate or the imamate was regarded as an obligation on the community that could be known more or less with certainty. That's obviously not the way that I'm using this. I'm using this as a stand-in for a certain development of popular sovereignty, a theory of popular sovereignty in a distinct regime type in modern Islamic thought. The overarching theme that I argue, in fact, is perhaps as much as divine sovereignty, the singular theme that distinguishes modern Islamic thought is the idea that, at the very least, the entire Muslim community collectively, and possibly even all of humanity collectively, has been designated as God's vicegerent or deputy or caliph on earth. This is something that is derived from the Quran, but is used in quite unique, novel, and powerful ways throughout the 20th century in particular. So the talk that I'm going to give today is the story of the development of this political theology, how it came to be that not only was all of mankind or all of the Muslim community seen as the repository of God's authority on earth, but what did this mean for the development of a distinct theory of politics, a distinct regime type, and what did this mean for the significance of Islamic law? Okay, so these are the questions. How did popular sovereignty come to be a core commitment of modern Islamic political thought? If it has come to be a commitment, my argument is that it had to be invented. It was not simply lying there in the history of Islamic thought, waiting to be reclaimed. Something had to happen to the materials of classical Islamic political thought. There are materials that made this possible, that made this easier, but what had to be stressed, what had to be rediscovered or reinvented, and what had to be sidelined. More importantly, what is the implications of a deep commitment to something like popular sovereignty have for other traditional commitments that more or less structured Islamic political thought into the 1920s? What implications does it have for the understanding of Islamic law or the Sharia? The authority of other forms of representation, rulers, sultans, scholars, other mediating elites. And what does it imply about the understanding of the basic features of political life? What theory of politics is this giving, not only for legitimacy or democracy or the rule of law, but what politics is about? What is the relationship between human nature, human thriving, and the political sphere? But moreover, what are the conditions of possibility for this theory of politics? What would have to be true for this kind of ideal regime type to be feasible, to be implementable? And if it's not the case that this is something that political Islamists can see as a regulatory ideal for politics, where does this leave political Islam today, not only as a series of social movements or parties, but as an intellectual tradition? What is the grand idea animating modern Islamic political thought after a century of successes and failures in trying to democratize and popularize Islamic political thought? My book is about popular sovereignty. It doesn't directly talk about democracy. So when we talk about popular sovereignty, first of all, this is because this is how Islamist thinkers themselves talk about it. When they introduce the idea of the universal caliphate, it is first to say the people is not sovereign. We are God's caliph, but this means that we are not sovereign. Later, in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s leading up to the Arab Spring, it is precisely the claim that the people is sovereign, that the people has some kind of share to sovereignty over the political realm that is thought to be derived from this political theology of the caliphate of man. So what do I mean by sovereignty? If that's true, if it is to be true that in some Islamic conception the people can be sovereign, what does that mean? What powers are being assigned to the people? What powers are not therefore being assigned to others? So very quickly, when I talk about sovereignty, I mean 5 primary things. And this is where the claim that the people can be sovereign is going to become very complicated. Now, the first is this idea that is sometimes referred to in political and legal theory as constituent power. We all know that in modernity, the people cannot govern directly. We cannot all assemble. Even a faculty of the University of Texas Law School cannot govern itself directly. It has to delegate to deans and committees and so forth. Nobody wants to be in that many meetings, even law professors. So the claim is that the people can be sovereign because the people has the ultimate authority to authorize political systems, So when you ask why a political system is legitimate, what makes one political system better than another, or more entitled to give law and to give command, the idea is that the people has consented to it, or perhaps the people has, in fact, authored it. The people has participated in creating a system of rule, giving it its legitimacy, and there is nothing deeper than the people. There is no further question to be asked. Why should I obey this regime? After you have provided the answer, because the people has created and consented to it. That's what one definition of sovereignty. It is often claimed within this theory of sovereignty that there is therefore a distinction between sovereignty and government. We don't think the president is sovereign. We don't think Congress is sovereign or the Supreme Court is sovereign. That is government. The people is sovereign because it holds the ultimate authority over the system that authorizes those different institutions. But I actually don't think that's correct. Because if to be sovereign is to give law, is to give the basic law like a constitution, it also holds that the exercise of supreme power within an ordained or a constituted regime also deserves to be described as sovereign powers. So the first and most obvious is lawmaking authority. In our mixed governmental system, the theory given to us by Montesquieu and Madison and Hamilton and so forth holds that sovereignty can be divided, that you can take an overall set of powers, the power of command, the power of giving law, the power of using violence, and this can be made safe for the people because it can be divided amongst different kinds of institutions. But sovereignty itself doesn't go away. The net force of political power that we call sovereignty hasn't therefore been vanished. You just try as long as you can to keep it held in different hands. So I want to claim that lawmaking authority, even within an established system of government, has to be regarded as a sovereign power. Similarly, interpretive or adjudicative authority. What does it mean to give law if you don't know what the law says? If Congress were also the supreme authority on what its own laws said, or whether its own laws are compatible with the Constitution, wouldn't it be the case that Congress is, by virtue of that, more sovereign than it is today? So adjudicative authority has to be part of sovereign power. Similarly, legitimate coercive power. For law to be something more than advice or morality, it has to have some sort of coercive power on the freedom of the individuals that are subject to it. And then finally, it is very common to say that there's an element of sovereignty beyond the law. To suspend a constitution is an aspect of sovereign power. To decide that the law does not bind you is an element of sovereign power. To say that I'm going to uphold a particular order around and beyond the law through violence is to make some kind of claim to sovereignty. So these are the 5 areas that I think are invoked when you say the people is sovereign. So very briefly, let me just anticipate something I'm going to say. If all it were claimed in modern Islamic democratic theory is that the people has the right to create the basic institutions that govern it, and to authorize that, but then has no authority whatsoever over lawmaking, only to appoint but not to participate in law, I think you would have to say that there is something slightly less than full legislative sovereignty being assigned to the people. And still to anticipate, that is a very, very common view in Sunni Islam, that the people has authority over its rulers. The rulers are agents of the people. But that the people has to appoint rulers, and the people has to obey religious scholars. So, spoiler alert, one of the things I'm going to argue is that the major twist in modern Islamic democratic theory is that you take the classical Sunni move, that the ruler is nothing other than an agent of the people, but then you also start to implicate active, popular, democratic authority in these other areas. What the law means, what the law says, is in some ways derived from popular legislative and political activity. That is the intellectual and moral revolution of modern Islamic political thought, and I want to see how we get there, what implications it has, and why it doesn't appear to be realizable. Now, to this point, all of this has been kind of generic. What's distinct about the Islamic context? I think there are three things that I don't want to spend too much time on because hopefully they're fairly self-explanatory. The first is that unlike, let's say, Western natural law, the problem of sovereignty in Islam begins with the fact that there is a law that precedes politics. Now, first of all, that itself is not distinct. John Locke would have said the same thing. Madison may have said the same thing, that there is some conception of natural law, that humans have natural rights that cannot be violated, and government can lose its legitimacy when certain natural rights are violated. So there is an idea that sovereignty itself is limited by the existence of a pre-political moral order. There is something before politics that constrains it. By the way, as an aside, we might not like that. We might think that the original sin of our system is in Federalist 10, where Madison says the right to private property is so deeply embedded in our natural talents, our natural differences, not our luck, but our endowments, and that government exists to uphold that claim to property that exists prior to civil society, prior to law. That may be the founding tragedy of our own political system, that a very unjust claim to private property is seen as preceding politics. So it's not necessarily a good thing to say that politics is constrained by law. But what's different about Islam? We're not talking about a natural law. We're not talking about a generic set of moral principles. We're talking about a positive divine law. By positive, it is a written law. It's not a code, but they are specific legal rulings that do not derive their legitimacy from the rulers, from the people, or from the political system. They're seen to come from God. That's not also unprecedented, but it is one specific element. But the second thing, who speaks in the name of this law? There is no pope, there's no church in Sunni Islam. Even in Shia Islam, where there's a slightly more hierarchical conception of religious authority, it was also a revolution in Shia Islam to say that you would have one single figure speaking for that. So Sunni Islam both posits a law that comes before politics, but no sovereign monopoly over it. It is dispersed among a class of religious scholars. Those of you that have read Hobbes's Leviathan recently, which I'm sure is most of you, this is Hobbes's nightmare. This idea that there is a law and a morality separate from sovereign authority that nobody in particular can even speak for is this Hobbesian nightmare of anarchy and dispersed authority to speak in the name of God, morality, and law. But third, and this is Professor Ayub's specialty, and he is the great authority on this aspect of Islamic political thought, which is that Islamic law traditionally, excuse me, sorry, I'll stop banging the podium. Islamic political thought traditionally had two spheres of law. This law of the religious scholars, fiqh, which you're now responsible for, and a distinct kind of law that only had to derive from a ruler or sultan's authority. So in addition to a divine law preceding politics, you also had claims of potential legal conflict within the political system. So I will skip over this somewhat quickly, but the classical problem of sovereignty in Islam is this idea of two spheres of law. One claims the right to represent text, the divine law, revelation, and that is religious scholars who recognize each other by virtue of their training and knowledge. But second, a claim to represent temporal law, to govern in the name of the public interest, the common weal, rather than textual interpretation. Again, sorry for the density of this slide. I kind of just want to have some things out there that we can move on. So this has now, this Hobbesian nightmare has this compounded form in Islam. First is, well, suppose you agree on who can speak in the name of each law. Fine. But who agrees on the boundary between them? Who says this is where the law of the religious scholars ends and the law of the rulers begins? You have to have some kind of authority, some kind of sovereign to speak in the name of that distinction between authorities. But then you get a sense of a further kind of potential conflict of authority is, suppose you agree on a certain kind of distinction, who judges on the implications of conflicts between those? What is higher? The law of the religious scholars or the law of the sultans? And in cases of conflict, who actually has the authority to decide on this moral constitutional crisis? So what's the classic answer? The classic answer is that you have a ruler. Just humming. There we go. It was, okay, I think we've got it for now. Okay. A ruler by whatever name who governs in the name of policy, discretion. These are all concepts that are also, used in our own constitutional system. If the Supreme Court is deciding that something is an area of public policy that the executive has a right to make a decision on, it is saying that there are some realms in which a certain legal rationale is higher than text or statute. Then, of course, the scholars, who have their own charismatic claims to be something called the heirs of the prophets, speak in the name of the religious law. And their claim is purely epistocratic. It's entirely derived from their knowledge, not from their appointment. In addition to this, you have, sort of filling in the gaps, an ill-defined body of elites, the people who loose and bind, those that are representing the people in appointing and giving authorization to government. At the bottom of this, you have this idea of the people, the ummah, which exists as a theological notion. But in terms of the operation of politics, it's largely a theological fiction. It is not held that even if the ruler is the people's agent, that he has to have a direct appointment by the people. So I want to summarize. What is the legacy of this classical Islamic political thought in terms of generating a latent crisis of sovereignty? The two spheres of law are not clearly and cleanly separable. And again, this is where Dr. Ayub writes on, that the scholars can say that what the ruler is doing violates the Sharia, but similarly, the ruler can say that his rationale trumps the application of the religious law, or even that he has the right to interpret the religious law. So, to make it a little bit more interesting and simple, it's not only that you have different powers or authorities. You have two underlying claims about what legal rationale is supreme in Islam. Is it the judgment of text? What does God's law say? Or is it the judgment of public interest? What, in a moment of crisis, has the supreme force? That this is the best interpretation of divine text, or that this is what's in the people's best interest at this time and moment? All right, so that's a very, very brief introduction to the classical legacy. And the point here is to say there are these conceptions of law that, first of all, don't involve the people, but also involve multiple legal rationales. And so therefore, if the people is going to be sovereign, there's a lot of work to be done. There are a lot of claims about the people's right to authority over these other authorities and institutions, and the people's right to speak in the name of the divine law. All right, so I pick up the story in the 1920s. A very, very important moment after World War I. The Ottoman Caliphate is being abolished by the incipient Turkish Republic. That's one big crisis. For the first time in centuries, you don't have an even symbolic office of the Caliphate that might claim to represent all Muslims. If you believe in this theory, then you might say that you have been sent back to a state of exception or even the state of nature. You are outside of legitimate governance. How do you get yourself back in? A second big crisis was an intellectual one. You had a scholar of Egypt's Al-Azhar University who wrote a text called Islam and the Principles of Government, in which he claimed that Islam prescribed no political system. The Prophet only came as a messenger or a warner, and that therefore Muslims were not obligated to restore the Caliphate or any other political system. And so this is a kind of argument for, if not secularism, at least radical freedom to design new political institutions. And so this provoked a torrent of responses, most important of which was possibly this text, El-Khilafa, by a very, very important Syrian-Egyptian scholar who tried to also assemble the representatives of the Ummah in 1926 to reestablish the caliphate. It's also where we get the greatest jurist in the Arab world of the 20th century, Abdul Razak Sanhuri, who later becomes the author of the Civil Code for Egypt and then almost every other Arab and many non-Arab Muslim countries. But he cuts his teeth in France, writing a PhD on public law in French on the public law of the caliphate. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this. I want to make one important point first. Even here in the 1920s, on the part of scholars like Ridda and others, it is not assumed that the people is sovereign. They do not begin with this claim that the people is God's caliph, and therefore, in the absence of a caliphate, all authority has devolved to the people. That will become the default position, but even as late as the 1920s, that was not what was imagined. So that's one point that I want to make. The office of the caliphate remains not the caliphate as the people's status, my caliphate of man, but the caliphate as a particular office. This becomes the linchpin for all public legitimacy. If Muslims are going to have a legitimate, legal public sphere, you must have a caliph. If you're going to have an evolving Sharia, you must have a caliph. But the other thing I want to say here is that we often associate Islamist movements with violence and revolution. And that is obviously not entirely incorrect. But there is also a surprising but profoundly important strain of what I call deep legality in modern Islamic political thought, which is that at this moment creates a legacy that I think exists until today, which is that Islamists, even those that claim the right to engage in violent revolution or something, believed that the ultimate sources for an Islamic system were not only deeply consensual, but also profoundly legalistic. So in trying to bring back the caliphate, these scholars in 1926 faced a kind of chicken and an egg problem. That we don't have the actual material power to impose a caliph on the ummah, but we have the moral legitimacy. If in principle we elected somebody, that person would in fact be the caliph. We have power as a kind of electoral college, but we know that we can't actually enforce this, so there's a kind of chicken and egg problem where you can never begin a legitimate political regime unless you already have a preceding material force behind it. That is not an astonishing statement, but it's a very, very important problem for modern Islamic thought, which wants to ground everything on contract, legality, and a profound kind of consensus on the part of those who are governed. Okay, so that's what I want to say about that. There's a kind of break at this point in which the Muslim world settles into post-colonial nation states, and this new movement called Islamism or political Islam develops as an oppositional movement, as a rejection of post-colonial nation states, secular dictatorships, military dictatorships, and in some cases traditional monarchies. And the claim here is that Islam has one principle of authority, and that is divine sovereignty. Any other claim to sovereignty, popular, democratic, monarchical, communist, on the basis of the proletariat, is illegitimate. Only God is sovereign. And the first argument for this is that the Quran itself says so. So there's a long list of Quranic verses establishing God's right as king, as master, the right to give law, the right to command. And this should not be unfamiliar to any student of the Old or the New Testament. But moreover, Islamic political thought is adapting itself to the modern period. And you get a number of arguments against democracy. Some of these are familiar to us today. We cannot know our true interests. Humans are epistemically fallible. We don't know what's in our best interests. Even if we could, we can't reliably act on them. Even if we could that, we're not entitled to give ourselves our own kind of legislation. And moreover, democracy usually ends up in oligarchy. And so apart from the idea that we're not entitled to legislate for ourselves, a lot of these critiques of democracy are back in fashion. Can we trust the people to not elect Donald Trump, to not elect Erdogan, to not elect Putin, to not do all of these kinds of terrible things? And if we can't, what faith do we have in the people as an agent that can govern itself? Moreover, even if we believe in democracy, we tend to think that it devolves into oligarchy. How can we have such faith in a system of rule that doesn't even deliver on its own promises? But more interestingly, Islamist thinkers start to develop theories of what's so good about divine law that not only function as arguments against democracy, but as subtle backdoor arguments for a kind of popular sovereignty. And that's the kind of paradox that I'm trying to bring attention to in my book, that popular sovereignty becomes as prominent as it does in modern Islamic political thought, not because of secularists, not because of liberals or modernizers, but partly because of the way that modern Islamists started to defend Islamic law. So they said that Islamic law is a kind of moral emancipation. And I think they're looking at Marxism, they may be looking at figures like Rousseau, and they understand that in the modern period, all politics is to a certain extent populist. Those who are governed have to have those laws justified to them. So there is a claim that God's law is substantively emancipatory. God's law makes you free. God's law makes you happy. So it is in your power and your obligation to choose to be ruled by a law that is also the path to your own freedom and moral fulfillment. But at this point, it is still minimally democratic at best. You still think that politics is about perfecting humans from above. The traditional authorities, like scholars, are still given substantial legislative authority. And you see politics in a very, very minimal sense. Politics is mostly about the application of law and not about the discovery of law. But at the same time, this is now when we start to get the Caliphate of man. The Pakistani Islamist leader and political thinker, Ala al-Maududi, who is the one that is making prominent this critique of democracy and this argument for divine sovereignty. He is writing in a world in which traditional rulers and traditional institutions no longer exist in an unmediated way. So who now has the authority? Where has authority devolved to bring this back to life? For him, it is mankind. Islam rears its polity on the foundations of the sovereignty of God and the vicegerency, the caliphate of man. In an Islamic state, the powers of vicegerency are not vested in any one individual or family, but in the whole Muslim community. The theocracy built up by Islam is not ruled by any particular religious class, but the whole community of Muslims, including the rank and file. So there's something almost Protestant about this. If you look at early modern European history, where in the argument, the Lutheran and Calvinist argument against the Pope is this idea of a priesthood of all believers. That's Luther's idea, which is the ultimate argument against the Catholic Church and authority. Modern Sunni Islam has something of this Protestantism, both individually and collectively, that God's vicegerent, God's deputy on earth, is the people at large, down to every individual rank and file believer. So what I want to say is that at this point, throughout most of the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, this is not a particularly democratic idea. It remains committed to certain kinds of formalist understandings of law. Law is there to be implemented, not to be reformed and discovered. But this is put into the bloodstream, the intellectual bloodstream of modern Islamic thought, that there is no going around this democratic caliphate, no going around the caliphate of man to some intermediary authority that has the right to establish governance. Everything has to go through the people. This is the crucial turn that, again, at this point, it remains minimally democratic. The way that I say this is, sort of a play on Machiavelli's conception of virtù, which really means power. Oh, actually, we're sitting here in the shadow of LBJ, right? And so, of course, LBJ remains the ultimate figure in American politics of the leader that knows how to use power. You can't walk around here without saying these photos of him standing over people and bullying people, and many liberals still valorize LBJ because he was the last democratic liberal president that really knew how to use power. That's what virtù is, right? the ability to twist arms and get done what you want to get done. And this is how I think at this point Maududi sees the people. The people is virtuous. The people believes in Islam. The people is pious. The people wants to bring this about. But the people also has virtu, the source of power. And the regeneration of the Muslim community over the West can only come from a regeneration of the people as virtuous and as powerful and cunning. Okay. I'm gonna briefly skip over this. I just want to mention a few points that after the 1950s and 60s, you get a number of different discourses that start theorizing the Islamic State. Some of these are activist Islamist discourses, talking about, what kind of state do we want to bring about. Some of these are traditionalist scholarly discourses coming out of Al-Azhar or other institutions of Muslim learning. And then some of them are kind of professional. So it might be a professor at a so-called secular university in Cairo or Damascus or someplace writes a treatise on Islamic constitutional law or constitutional theory. So there is a kind of vast discourse that develops from the 1950s that becomes more academic, more scholarly, more professional, that is devoted to working out what is an Islamic constitutional regime, an Islamic state that is governed by the rule of law. And it is now that we start to see a ubiquitous, juridical commitment to popular sovereignty. The people is always portrayed as the source of political authorities. They talk about the sovereignty of the people as the source of sovereignty. Moreover, it's simply assumed that government is limited. Government is a form of contract. The ruler can never be sovereign. The ruler is an agent of the people, chosen by consultation. And the people has some power to redesign institutions as long as the Islamic law, the Sharia, in some ways remains supreme. Now, what I want to argue is that underneath this modal Islamic constitutional theory that is juridical in nature, there is a deeper political theology that starts to animate the Islamist movement around the 1980s and 90s. Islamists, perhaps embarrassed by certain kinds of civil wars or violent organizations, are very keen to insist on their rule of law and democratic credentials. You don't have to worry about us. You don't have to fear us. We also believe in democracy. But the theory of democracy that starts to be developed is very profound. And it's not simply generic parliamentary democracy with a few Quranic verses attached to it. It is a deep political theology of what it means for a society to be governed both by God and by the people simultaneously. And here, it is this political theology of the Caliphate of man that is absolutely fundamental. What does this political theology do? And I'm skipping out on the Quranic verses that they're getting this from, but you rest assured that they're there. I think it does four things. First, it provides what I would call a theological anthropology. It says what humans are. And this is crucial to understanding why humans should be able to govern themselves. If humans are irredeemably ignorant about their own interests, then how can you expect some form of self-government? If human beings are irredeemably unable to control our passions, how can we be expected to govern ourselves? So the first thing that happens is that this doctrine of the universal caliphate is treated as the theory of the human. What is the human? The human is God's vicegerent on earth. God has gifted humanity with a moral personality, a capacity to acquire morality and virtue, with reason, with language, a capacity to learn, and a capacity to suppress private interest in the name of morality and public interest. Second, it gives a theology to this idea that the people underpins political authority. It is not just a juridical principle that the ruler is the people's agent. It's not just an accident of Islamic law that the ruler is appointed rather than divinely designated. It is a theology that is immutable, that God may be sovereign, but he has devolved all of his authority once and for all onto the people, and nothing else comes in between. So therefore, no one but the people has any foundational political legitimacy. And finally, combining the idea of a moral theology and a theological story of the human, thus comes an Islamic human rights scheme. We have certain kinds of rights because of the beings that we are. And in some ways, it's remarkably similar to a lot of early modern liberal theory. It's very Lockean in some ways, and it's even Kantian in some ways. All right, but what I want to argue is that this really becomes an ideal theory of Islamic democracy. This is not just lip service, and it's not just a kind of ad hoc, we're Democrats because we elect our ruler. There was a deep, deep theory, and it has the following features. Again, the Ummah, the people, it has been deputized by God. This is the idea of the universal caliphate that is now spoken of in the language of sovereignty as opposed to merely vicegerency. The people is sovereign because the people and no one else is God's deputy. Therefore, all constituted bodies are derived from the people, including the scholars. So this is one major twist. In Sunni Islam, it's very, very easy to say that the secular rulers derive their authority from the people. Very easy. Even kings. It's very hard to say that the religious scholars derive their right to speak in the name of the divine law only from the people. That's a radical revolution of the mind, and that is one of the fundamental features of this ideal theory. There are theories of divisions of powers and institutions, but there is a rejection of the Western liberal conception. They will mention Montesquieu and Madison by name and say it's okay to have different powers, but their separation must not be allowed to overwhelm the ultimate purpose of moral unity. So they read Federalist 10 and they say that's for them, but not for us. But moreover, why did I give you all that introduction about these two different spheres of law, fiqh and siyasa, the scholar's law and the ruler's law? That distinction exists, but it's downplayed and almost collapsed. So from these two spheres of law, you increasingly get this vision of a unitary political and juridical order. There is one space of law and politics that is governed by the same rationale. Moreover, the people is now not merely represented and is not merely cared for, but exercises direct political responsibility and judgment. In some ways, this theory is more democratic than theories of representative government. It says in moments of constitutional crisis, when the Supreme Court can't agree with the president and the legislature, the question devolves to the people. It goes directly to popular referendum. All of the institutions should derive their authority directly from the people rather than from appointment by intermediary institutions. So in some ways it's radically democratic. It's almost like the French Revolution or theories of republicanism in which the people is actively self-governing directly and by its own virtue and capacity to argue. So what has happened to the Islamic law? What is Islamic about this theory of governance? It doesn't go away, obviously. There's still a very, very rigorous commitment to the ideal that Sharia is governing. And in fact, they say the people is not free to abandon Islam. If the people decides that it's going to govern itself by something else, then the people dissolves itself. It is as if the people has committed suicide. Not physically, but representatively, symbolically, and morally. The people has become something else. And so there is a complex theory of the limits of constituent power. In a radical sense, the people's will has already been given. The people is not free to change its will because the will of the people to be God's vicegerent is what makes it the people. So to adapt a different will would be to literally dissolve it into something else. So the Sharia is supposed to remain sovereign and supreme. But what does this mean? In effect, there is also a move here to say that what is sovereign in the Islamic Sharia is no longer specific texts of revelation or classical jurisprudence, but universals, generalities, principles. God's law is eternal because it's general. Or what is general in God's law is what is universal and eternal, not what is specific. So what do you apply? How do you enforce God's law at all? There is a theory of a complex dialectic or process between texts of revelation, the act of interpretation, but also acts of judgment about public interest. What is good for us now? Is it good for us now to, let's say, equalize inheritance between men and women? Well, we have texts that say inheritance is not equal between men and women. Men get twice what women get. Well, you can interpret that, you can give it a context. But in addition to that, you might say that the Sharia is ultimately enforced when the people is also deliberating on what is in its public interest now and at this time and place. So what I want to argue is this is the final triumph of the idea of popular sovereignty. The people become sovereign when they are described as sovereign over the application of Sharia to the concrete. No one would ever say that people invents divine law, can reject divine law, but they will say that divine law is implemented through the people's active political participation and deliberation on text, interpretation, and its own interest. Now this raises an obvious question. Who can do this? What kind of people is fit for this kind of democracy and self-government? So this ideal theory of an Islamic republic is a kind of republic of virtue. It presumes moral unity. We begin with the assumption that we're all Muslim, and we're all more or less good Muslims. We want to be faithful to God in our own welfare, and we see politics through this light. So there's an assumption of virtue, goodwill, and an intellectual passion for bringing about the divine law. So that's what it would mean. That's the question of Islamic democracy. So I would say the question is not what we often hear in the public sphere. Can Islam be democratic or whatever? The question is, according to this theory, can a people collectively see itself as the guardian and adjudicator of God's law in specific times and places? And so this is where I conclude. I conclude by observing that this is a fairly sophisticated theory of an ideal regime type. And I think you can get the sense that I have a lot of intellectual respect for it. I wrote a whole book trying to tease out what it means. But I think it's impossible to bring about, not only in theory, but particularly in the circumstances of modern politics. The most important is that in assuming moral unity, it does not take seriously the problem of moral pluralism. So the figures that I work on, the most important one is the Tunisian political thinker and party leader, Rashid al-Ghanouchi. In his books, he explicitly says, Madison and Montesquieu are not for us. They assume that pluralism is innate to human nature, but that's because of their experience with the wars of religion and the Reformation. For us Muslims, we can assume moral unity, but you can't. And they have learned this through politics, that Muslim societies are just as riven by disagreement about religion, about what it means, about what is valuable, and what is the balance between a certain conception of morality and human freedom. I have some other things that I don't think are quite as important right now about the effect of politics in actually engaging in open, democratic, agonistic politics, where there is nothing outside of politics to save you. There is nothing other than your negotiation and bargaining with the people that you have to live with. There is a transformation in terms of not only what you think is possible and what you can bring about, but what politics is about. Is politics really about this moral perfection and people deliberating on the divine law? Or is politics about much more banal things, like 15% unemployment, and how to reassure one another that you are not a threat to them? And so I close with this idea that this has occasioned another revolution in modern Islamic thought, which is that our ideal of an Islamic democracy is sort of stillborn. It's proven to be unrealizable before we've even attempted it. And the writings of a lot of particularly Tunisian, but to some extent Indonesian and Turkish thinkers, the claim is that we have to break with political Islam and even this theory of Islamic democracy, and we're now going to refer to ourselves as something else called Muslim Democrats. And the way that I conclude my book is saying this is probably an inevitable development, but this alternative theory of what is this other ideology is very ad hoc, it's very thin, it's not as abstract and systematic as the previous theory was, and I think apart from politics and crises that are going on in the Middle East, a very, very important intellectual development to follow is the way in which Islamic political thought develops new ways of thinking about what Islam has to say about politics beyond just capturing the state and implementing a kind of conception of virtue. And I think that is at a very, very early stage of thinkers really devoting hard work and attention to that. Thank you.
Thank you. So can there be questions, please? Bob.
So, first of all, that was a tour de force. My hat is off to you.
Thank you.
So I want to understand whether there's a particular institutional cash out of the theory with respect to the ultimate interpretive institutions.
Mm-hmm.
People like to talk about he who decides the exception is the sovereign.
Yes.
But in actual practice, it's much more often it's he or she or it that decides the application of the rule to the facts at hand, without having to turn off the law. It's just interpreting the law that does most of the work most of the time. Does this theory point towards a particular institutional solution to that question?
Yes, it does. And so I want to say a few things about that. First, what I tried to say here is that there's a kind of plateau on which almost all modern Islamic constitutional theorists operate. And that transcends a lot of the conflicts that we see today since the Arab Spring. So you can talk, I think, reasonably about what neo-traditionalist scholars from Al-Azhar or non-activist lawyers writing in secular universities or Islamist activists think about the institutional authority. And it's remarkably common across all of these. And it's very, very familiar. You have an elected assembly that has extensive authority to make law in areas of public policy. But that body also has the obligation to both codify as many areas of Islamic law as possible. So part of their task should be not legislating in the name of their own authority and will and sovereignty, but simply enforcing and codifying a workable version of what Islamic law already gives the Muslim community. And then ubiquitously and universally it is claimed that there must be some court-like authority that stands in judgment over this body with the capacity to judge Sharia compatibility. So it's like a Supreme Court that judges not only constitutionality for that particular regime, but the very idea of Sharia compatibility. And so the Iranian constitution of 1982 eventually is the preeminent example of this, where you have a guardian council that sits outside of the political realm and can strike down legislation on the basis of Sharia incompatibility. That basic structure is ubiquitous also in Sunni Islamic political thought. So anybody that put forward a proposal has something like this. There has to be some body. Now what becomes interesting are the following things. Who constitutes that body? In both senses. Who appoints it, but also who can serve on it. So another very, very ubiquitous feature is that it is not assumed that only classically trained Islamic scholars can serve in this capacity. Even the original exemplar of it, the 1907 Iranian constitution, the supplement to the 1906, which created a similar body, didn't only have religious scholars participating in it. The Pakistani Federal Sharia Court does not only have classically trained religious scholars. So that's one thing, and that's one marker of where whoever has this capacity derives it from the political system, which is derived from the people itself. So that's one important point. Now, that's a pretty generic view of Islamic constitutionalism. If you took the democratic motive seriously, in addition to that institutional, then some of the other things you might expect would be more referenda. So a constitutional provision for crises in the interpretation of Islamic law to be ultimately decided by popular referendum. So that's one point. Second, and this may or may, depending on how Habermasian you are, this may or may not be a cop-out, there's a lot of emphasis placed on the power of civil society. So the way that Jürgen Habermas talks about a common will being developed over time by the public sphere, by debate, by argumentation, by the relationship between this and parliaments and constitutional courts. There's a similar vision here, that the people is going to make itself free. The people is going to make itself harmonious with its political system through an open, liberalized, but also religiously dense public sphere that has civil society organizations, education, free press, that is going to be contributing to the formation of what might count as a good Islamic justification for a law in the public sphere. So that is one thing that you'd expect. And since you asked that, this is another source of my skepticism about this theory, which is that it's the problem that faces all democratic theories and all Republican theories, is that this theory of Islamic democracy downplays the alienation between the governed and the governors. It downplays the alienation between representative institutions and those who are appointing representatives. It tries to portray this as a relationship of mutual support and conversation. Whereas, as we all know, in complex modern societies, there is severe alienation and distance between both elected bodies and the people, but also between the vast unelected aspects of a modern state, the administrative apparatus, the security apparatus. And so one of the things I think that troubles this theory is not that it's going to, devolve into dictatorship, but that it's going to devolve into ordinary state oligarchy. That states develop their own rationales, and this vision that is going to be constantly nourished by the public sphere and by the public's participation is not something that they developed an institutional solution to. So the general ways in which all modern republicanism is very, very difficult to sustain in modern conditions also, I think, troubles this theory.
Again, I don't understand this with any depth, but how would you react to the argument that sort of Britain at the time of its constitutional monarchy, with the Constitution being the Quran and the various elites taking on certain roles and the public not knowing what its interest, that there was many parallels to in that world to what potentially is trying to be developed here?
Which constitutional monarchy do you mean?
The British.
Oh, well, like I said, actually, I do think that there are some important similarities to certain kinds of early modern liberal social contract theory. That there's a significant space for constraining politics before the law, that certain kinds of constitutional monarchies can be perfectly legitimate, that representatives have an ultimate control over the system, but they themselves are constrained. So yeah, I think there are a lot of similarities, and I think there are a lot of people that do continue to see constitutional monarchy as the most appropriate regime for a Muslim society.
That's kind of what's getting at.
Yeah.
I wanted to say thank you for being here. I've been looking forward to the talk all weekend. So I have two questions. My first question is, so being a scholar of this magnitude, do you think that an Islamic democracy and a populist democracy can coexist? And my second question is that at the beginning you did emphasize the demarcation between the Sharia law versus the law of the people.
Or the ruler.
Or the rule of law, So I just want to know, so in some countries where they have Muslims and Christians, there has been issues as to whether the Sharia law is the ultimate law or versus the rule of law being the ultimate law. So where is that balance?
Great, those are great questions.
Yes, where do we?
Okay, so the first question. So one of the things that I'm trying to say is that this theory of Islamic democracy is a kind of populist democracy, in the sense that it has representative institutions, it has elites, but it really places its hope in the virtue and the political activity of the people at large. It is the people at large that really provides the legitimacy for law and politics more than just procedure or institutions. And I think that's one of the paradoxes of this theory, is that it in its justification populist, but like every other populist movement, it inclines towards wanting to control what the people actually will or what they view, and it's very hard to have a non-oligarchical understanding of what the people actually wants or what it's doing. Your other question about Muslims and Christians is an excellent one, and it's one that I would have to say doesn't trouble these thinkers as much as you think it might. So they would say, in Islam, that's an easy question. Christians do not have to be governed by Islamic law. They can have their own family law, they can have wine, they can eat pork. They are just limited in certain things that they can do in the public sphere. So in certain areas that concern both Muslims and Christians, or all citizens of a state, then everybody is constrained by the same sort of thing. So you can worship, but you can't proselytize. You can't try to convert Muslims over to a different religion. And so you're constrained in what you do in the public sphere, and therefore, in a theory that is thickly democratic, non-Muslims can participate, non-Muslims can serve in office, but insofar as certain areas of the law do appear to implicate very sensitive areas of religious interpretation, there may be a kind of second-class citizen that you can contribute your knowledge, you can contribute your sense of what's in the public interest, but democracy really comes to life when people are deeply emotionally invested in the correct interpretation of the divine law and the well-being of the community. So their claim would be that non-Muslims are not persecuted and that there's something more than tolerated, but that they are not fully experiencing the relationship of sovereignty over the political sphere that Muslims would be.
Can I give a follow-up?
Yeah, of course.
So what about if we think about it this way, that Muslims who practice Sharia law and live in a confined sovereignty, don't they partake in the social contract by giving up something to be in a sovereignty? Doesn't that mean that the regular or populist rule of law should always trump the Sharia law in itself?
So no. So that's the whole point of the theory, is that the people cannot choose to completely neglect the Sharia. That is where the people's freedom ends, to abandon the divine law. And then you have a crisis. Then you have a sense of, well, if they try, what do the others who want to remain faithful do? What is their relationship to this non-Islamic state or public order? And that's been a massive area of literature in Islamist writings for decades, which is, how do you relate to this non-Islamic state? Yep.
So I'm curious why the more general interpretation of Sharia doesn't work against the salience of the religious pluralism. I guess, if they're interpreting these general principles for Sharia, why does that not make it kind of the technical aspects of how you practice your religion irrelevant as well?
Okay, I'm not sure I understand the question, so let me try to... So another comparison between this Islamic theory and early modern liberal theory is a certain distinction between the public and the private. So when you read John Locke's Letter on Toleration, it is, I don't care how you worship, and neither should the ruler, unless it concerns a public matter. I'm never interested in how you're worshiping because I think that you're going to fail to connect with God. It's only if it affects something in the public sphere. The Islamic conception has some of that, although it's not exactly right. There still is an obligation to uphold the truer aspects of doctrine and practice. But there is recognized that amongst Muslims, there are disagreements about how to interpret text. And those disagreements have to be honored. That part of the purpose of an Islamic state is to make the world safe for Muslims to act on their conscience, even if you disagree. So I may disagree in your interpretation that a woman should wear a face veil, but I agree that it is a legitimate interpretation that should be respected. Now, where I thought you were going was to say, in social contract theory, in the state of nature, you have all of these rights. You can accumulate property, but you also have the obligation to try to defend it yourself. Good luck, right? So in entering civil society, you give up your right to all of your private freedoms. I thought you were asking, is something similar going on in Islam? Is that? No, not what you're asking.
But I'm interested in your answer.
And the answer is yes and no. So they want to preserve a lot of the innate freedom to interpret scripture and to live according to your conscience. But yes, and if the public authority decides that something is in the public interest, you may lose your freedom to act on your conscience. You don't have to be regarded as wrong, and you may in the future be able to act on it, but your freedom in that moment can be constrained by the public authority. Yes?
Thank you so much. This was an amazing talk. I took a ton of
Thank you very
notes.
much.
Were you asking me to go?
I think so. I think, yeah, I was.
So I have
Yes.
I have two questions. One is I think I can put it simply, and the second one I'm going to try to piece together. The simple question is, where does the thinking of like secularists like Abdullahi and Naim fit
Yeah.
into this picture? Because these thinkers that you're talking about are trying to imagine an Islamic democracy, and then you have those
Yeah.
like Naim who seems to have a very different vision. So that's
Right.
one question. And the second question is, do these thinkers, you said that they don't take pluralism seriously, but I'm also wondering if they don't take vice or corruption or the abuse of power seriously.
Yeah.
Is that taken into account? And that sort of connects with, in some ways, I think the problem even with our own constitution.
Right.
Is that we have a theory, but it doesn't truly take into account complete disregard
Right.
for those institutions.
Yeah.
So one is the problem of vice and the other and
Yeah.
power, and the other is the problem of the question of secularism.
That's great. So Abdullahi Naim, again, he's not part of this conversation at all. Now, his argument, as far as I understand it, for secularism that he wrote about 10 years ago, not to keep on making this point, but it's a lot like Hobbes, surprisingly. And this is what I've told him. I don't think he liked it, but I told him. So Hobbes, why is Hobbes so big on sovereignty as opposed to religious freedom? Because it's like that bumper sticker, radical agnostic. I don't know, and neither do you. That's kind of Abdullahi's position. He's kind of an epistemic radical agnostic. That he thinks that because God's speech is so alien to us, and because every act of interpretation is only a human interpretation. It's almost like the second the human, it's like the observer's paradox. The second human eyes meet revelation, it is something other than divine. And it is therefore human. And so I can't impose on you anything related to religious practice because it would never have anything of the divine. And so therefore any practice of religion has to be radically voluntary, only based on your own conscience, because you can never obtain the epistemic certainty that what you're claiming is a more reasonable interpretation of Scripture than anybody else's.
So what are the limits of this
Yeah.
perspective's idea of you cannot leave Sharia?
Yes.
Or you have to, or there has to be, there is not, or there is room
So
for
this
that
view
for
does,
someone like that.
right. So this view doesn't have that epistemic skepticism at all. So on the one hand, it does think that tradition got some stuff right. That the traditional methods of interpretation are valuable, and that there are some things that we can know with more or less certainty. But also, it has this kind of like modern Republican view that the voice of the people is the voice of God. And this is an old view in like Western, even Machiavelli. Why is Machiavelli a Republican? Because of like this epistemic democracy. The people deliberate better in groups than individually, and the people are more likely to get it right than an individual ruler. And so you see this view in Aristotle, you see this view all throughout political theory, that the greater the number of people deliberating, the more likely you're going to get to some kind of conception of truth. So Abdullahi's view begins with this like radical skepticism that is like very similar to what was going on in early modern Europe after Descartes. And so then, you get Hobbes that says, you can never know that you're right anyway. But what you can know is that you have to obey the secular sovereign, the civil sovereign. Okay, So that's one question. The second question is, they take vice extremely seriously. In fact, I should have mentioned that, and you're right to bring it up. The whole theory is based on the problem of vice. The whole theory is based on we are suffering under corrupt rulers, dictators. How do you solve that? How does Islam prescribe a regime that will not be subject to tyranny and the arbitrary will of rulers? And the answer is that part of it is this Madisonian theory, or this Montesquieuian theory. You don't give anybody absolute power. If the ruler never has absolute power, and the ruler is only ever an agent of the people, then you remove the initial risk of tyranny by a significant amount. Then, when you build up your institution, you avoid the consolidation of power. But the answer is, that's never enough. What happened to Europe? The Holocaust, destroying the environment, Vietnam. Their constitutional theories have not prevented them from doing great evil. So institutional design is not enough. That's the big insight. You need virtue. Where does that come from? Religion. But that's why it presumes a deep agreement on what virtue is and what truth is. And that's what makes it distinctive, right? It's not the same theory as a mixed government theory. That's what makes it an Islamic democratic theory, is it says you cannot get away from the need for people to try to be good in public.
Another question, Paul?
Yeah, quickly, if you took, I have a very practical kind of a conversation here I'm going to have about the Islamic groups that have led terrorist movements. So if you compared Bin Laden and the religious scholars who advised him, and you took that with Baghdadi and those that described, would the big differences from them with regard to a caliphate be strategic, or would they be nested in your arguments here? Okay, good. So very, very subtle question. So the distinction between strategic and, in fact, I'll go back to this. In fact, I have a paper on arguing the caliphate at the dawn and dusk of Sykes-Picot. So this happens right after the Europeans chop up the Middle East. Right. And this is when they're debating the caliphate. And then the other big moment was in 2014, when ISIS and Al-Qaeda are arguing back and forth with one another about why the other is wrong. And so, now, here's what's very interesting. What did I say? That there is a deep legality for the foundation and constitution of this political order. Well, get rid of the deep part of that. Everybody agrees that there's a kind of legality. Now, what makes a caliphate legal? It's that the caliph has been appointed by the correct people who loose and bind. So, at some point, unless you think it has to be every member of the Muslim community, you're just bargaining over the details. So this guy and everybody that tried to come to this Cairo conference in 1926 said, we are the people who loose and bind. This guy, Ridda, he tried to invite everybody. A guy from Poland, an American, Omanis, he wanted every single Muslim community to be represented. And then, if they all agreed on a caliph, it would have a profound claim to legality. But he also wanted it to have power. So they didn't want a Napoleon to come to power and then just be anointed caliph. So that's what I mean by deep legality. They wanted both the election to be representative, but also the election to be that which caused the investiture of the caliph. Okay, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, what do they think? They all think that a caliph is not appointed by God. That would make them atheists, infidels. But who can appoint them? So ISIS said, we're the only Muslims left on earth. We're the only ones fighting for the liberation of Muslim territory and the implementation of God's law. So our council is the people who loose and bind for all Muslims. So when Caliph Baghdadi was elected, it was elected on the authority of their own Shura council. What did Al-Qaeda say? In principle, you could be right, but you made a tactical and a strategic error because you've divided the Muslim community. When you claim to have established the caliphate, what you're saying is that everybody has an obligation to obey you. You have put yourself above the tangle of different groups, and you have said, you are the ummah, you are the Muslim community. And if you don't give me your oath of loyalty, you're an apostate that can be killed. So Al-Qaeda's first response is, you've basically just dumped this massive stink bomb into the middle of the jihadi community. Now, instead of fighting the occupiers, all jihadis have to argue about is whether you're the caliph or not. Who needed that? Okay. Second, you guys make us look bad, right? Al-Qaeda would never go for that kind of violence. So in the beheadings and the mass executions, you have given the world a vision of the caliphate that we in Al-Qaeda simply can't abide by, okay? Second, but the third argument was the caliphate has to be more representative than that. It's not everybody, but it's all of the jihadi scholars. So they said your problem is that you weren't representative enough in your election of the caliphate. If you had gotten all of the right-thinking, like-minded scholars on board and made an effort to create a consensus, then we could have gotten on board with you. But you have to control more territory than that as well. So that was the. But you're right. So this is that's exactly the kind of thing that it gets to. Any other? Was that the end of time? What?
We can talk offline.
Okay.
Please join me in thanking Dr.
Thank you.